So I'd like to add my thanks and that of the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform to everybody who's been involved in organising this morning's event, which I think we're all very much looking forward to. So thank you very much to our colleagues in the 3 regional assemblies, ESF and ERDF, for organising, and well done. It looks like a really interesting day. So the consultation workshop will cover the partnership agreement, the European Regional Development Funding, or ERDF, and European Social Funds, or ESF. And I suppose our aims today are twofold. We'd like to update you in relation to the cohesion policy negotiations in the EU and how they're going, and I know that Ben and Luke will do that later. But we'd also like to hear from you about what you believe we should be investing ESF and ERDF funds in. And there's going to be a number of opportunities for your views. Pádraig made reference to some of those earlier. So we're going to have our breakout sessions in the 3 regions. And we have an opportunity for an online survey. And also you can provide written submissions, and that'll be open until September the 4th. So there's quite a bit of time still to do that, and we'd really encourage you to get involved. So the breakout sessions then are going to be divided into the Eastern and Midland, Northern and Western and Southern region. And each of the breakout sessions will take both a regional and a national perspective into account. So just in relation to the funds, you'll probably have seen some of the coverage there last weekend about the marathon session that the leaders of the 27 EU member states held, and they have agreed a budget for 2021 to 2027. And the next step now will be for that budget to be consented to by the European Parliament. So while the full breakdown isn't available, Ireland is set to receive a reduced allocation in real terms for ERDF and ESF for 2021 to 2027 compared to our previous round. So therefore, leveraging greater impact and value for money is going to be even more important this time around. The partnership agreement, which sets out the strategic funding priorities, will also focus on maximising those complementarities between the funds and in meeting regional and national needs. So anyway, just the next steps, we'd encourage you all to fill out the survey on ESIF. All the submissions received will be published later in the year. We'll also make available a summary to all of you for your convenience. Today's consultation is very important in informing us as we design and begin to write up the partnership agreement and the operational programmes for ERDF and ESF. And we will be liaising constantly with the European Commission as we do that. But there will be another opportunity. We will come back to you again when we have draft operational programmes and draft partnership agreements to consult with you once more. So without further ado, Pádraig, I'm going to hand back to you because I know that we have 2 very interesting videos from the 2 ministers involved, and I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say as well. Thank you once again to everybody for joining us today.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Thank you very much. Yes, as Anne-Marie just indicated there, we'll now have 2 short video messages from TD Michael McGrath, Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform, and also from Simon Harris, TD and Minister for Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science. So Barry, if you want to let those 2 clips roll, that'd be great.
Hi everyone. I want to thank you all for attending this webinar today. I particularly want to thank the 3 regional assemblies. They've worked closely with the staff from my own department and from Minister Harris's department in planning the consultation process. I'm delighted to see that a broad range of stakeholders from all across the country have registered for the webinar today. This broad representation is really important as we seek views today and through our online portal on how needs at a national and regional level can be addressed by these funds. And your views will help identify the priorities for investment. Cohesion policy is the EU's strategy to promote and support the overall harmonious development of its member states and regions. It is an important tool to stimulate economic growth, promote social cohesion and reduce disparities between the regions of the EU. This government is committed to strong regional development, and this is evident from our commitment to aligning the National Development Plan's capital investment with a national planning framework. The National Planning Framework ensures a strong regional dimension into decision making on public capital investment priorities through the regional spatial and economic strategies. The European Regional Development Fund, for which my department has responsibility, aims to strengthen economic and social cohesion in the European Union by correcting imbalances between its regions. It does this by investing in growth-enhancing sectors to improve competitiveness and create jobs. Last week, I announced a very significant stimulus package along with my government colleagues to respond to the economic impact on Ireland of COVID-19. And the European Regional Development Fund will be another useful resource for Ireland in our response to the pandemic. You will also have an opportunity to discuss priorities for the future of the European Social Fund today, which will be an important tool to foster employment, improve education and skills in our workforce, and tackle poverty and social exclusion. We look forward to hearing your views, both in this seminar and through written submissions on the portal. Thank you very much and enjoy the webinar.
Hi there, and thank you so much for taking part in this workshop
Sorry.
on the next round of cohesion funding for Ireland. It's so important we hear your views, and I really appreciate you giving of your time today. As my colleague Minister McGrath has said, there's clearly a very diverse range of views represented in this workshop, and that's right and that's proper, because we need to hear everybody's voice as we prepare for the next round of cohesion funding. So I very much welcome the opportunity to bring people together today. My new department, the Department of Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science, quite the mouthful, will have the responsibility for managing the European Social Fund from an Irish perspective. And as you know, this is a fund to create a more social Europe. And never has there been a more important time to try and tackle these issues. Issues in relation to poverty, employment, unemployment, skills. How do we make sure that everybody feels the benefits of being members of the European Union, being citizens of Europe? And after the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the devastating impact that has had on so many households, so many livelihoods, and so many people, it's really important that Ireland is prepared and well positioned to benefit from the next round of funding. So we need to hear your views. I'm particularly interested in making sure we can address skills issues as well. So we've a lot of work to do. So thank you very much for taking part today. I look forward to taking your insights on board, working with Minister McGrath, and making sure Ireland is really well positioned for the next round of cohesion funding. Have a good day.
Sorry, Porrick, you're on.
Porrick, you're on mute.
Excuse me, apologies for that all. I remained on mute, which is probably good news for some. I was just making the comments that we heard a commitment from the political leaders there of both departments, and we we got an insight into their thoughts on the importance of the funds and how we need to prioritise going forward. So I would now like to invite and welcome Ben Sweeney from the Department for Public Expenditure and Reform, and his colleague Luke Devoy from Department for Education and Skills and the ESF Managing Authority, to give us a briefing on the operational programmes for both the RDF and then subsequently for ESF, respectively, and to help set the scene for the discussion groups later on, I guess. So over to you guys.
Okay, good morning. My name is Ben Sweeney. I'm from the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, and I'm going to talk to you today about the Partnership Agreement and the European Regional Development Fund. And then I'm going to hand over to my colleague Luke Devoy, and he's going to talk to you about the European Social Fund. So just get this going. There we go. That can be seen there. Okay, so essentially, there's four major things that shape the programs, overarching things that shape the programs for the next 7 years. And they are, first of all, the legislation. The legislation, as Anne-Maria referred to, is being negotiated in Brussels at a European Union level. So that legislation, sets out things like the scope of support for the ERDF and the ESF and other European instruments. So that's very important in framing what the policy is and where money can be spent. The second thing is the Commission co-finances all of the ERDF and ESF. So it provides investment guidance to different member states and where they see investment needs under the different funds. So the investment guidance is an important part of the puzzle in terms of us drafting up programs. When we're negotiating with the Commission later in the year or early, on the programs and the design, they'll be asking about whether we've invested in those areas, and if not, why not. So that's another important factor. Then the third thing is the needs analysis, which is the evidence base for the programs. So the evidence base, we asked an independent consultancy, Indicon, to draw where they saw the needs for the ERDF and the ESF. So in the slot after myself and Luke, Hugh Hennessy from Indicon will talk more about the needs analysis and what they found there. So hopefully that'll be really useful in framing the discussions later on in terms of where funding could be put. And then finally, the consultation process is obviously another important factor in framing and designing the programs. And Luke might talk a little bit more about them in his presentation. But for my presentation, I'll focus mainly on the legislation and the investment guidance. Okay. So before I get into the partnership agreement and the ERDF, I'll just update you very briefly on the key kind of legislative developments at a European Union level. The first is in May 2018, the legislative proposals for cohesion policy, which includes the ERDF, the European Regional Development Fund, and the European Social Fund. And even though these were published nearly 2 years ago, these regulations are still under negotiation. They're negotiated by the 27 European Union member states and the European Parliament. Then there's another two pieces of information just to give you some background on what's been happening in Brussels. The first is the Commission announced a new Just Transition Fund in January of this year, and that's a fund to enable different regions to transition and reduce the socioeconomic costs of transitioning away from fossil fuels to greener industries. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because it's proposed to be under the partnership agreement. So it's not something we're going to talk about directly today, but it's linked closely enough with the ERDF and ESF that's been programmed separately by the Department of Climate Action. And then the third thing to mention is over spring this year, the European Union at the EU level, they brought in a number of adoptions to the current round of programs, the 2014 to 2020 programs, to respond to the immediate crisis of the COVID-19. So what they've done in a nutshell is they've expanded the scope of the current regulations to allow them to invest in things which they didn't traditionally invest in, like personal protective equipment for healthcare staff and so on, to deal with the immediacy of the crisis. So there's more flexibility in where those EU funds could be spent. And then they've also expanded those programs within a budget out to 2022. So that's just to be aware of, that those programs will run on for another few years alongside what we're talking about today. However, we're not going to talk about them directly today, but that's just by way of background. So now I'm going to turn to discussing, first of all, the partnership agreement, and then the European Regional Development Fund for the next 7 years. So the partnership agreement is basically, it's a high-level strategic document, and it defines the priority areas for investment for the different funds for the period of 7 years. This includes the ERDF, the ESF, and a number of other funds like the JTF and the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund and others. And And basically, this is a useful tool in a way because it allows us to coordinate between the different government departments and managing authorities on designing the programs and setting out the investment priorities. And it's a short document we negotiated with the Commission. One of the things it does is it identifies any overlaps between these funds and national and regional policies and other EU instruments. So that's what the partnership agreement is in a nutshell. And we have a partnership steering group, and that includes the government departments, but it also includes the regional assemblies and some NGOs and social partners. So it's a good broad representation on the steering group overseeing this process. So now I'm going to turn to the European Regional Development Fund for the rest of my presentation. So as Anne-Marie mentioned at the start in her opening address, the European Council has just agreed the outline of a budget last week of just over it sounds like a massive amount of money, over €1 trillion. That budget now has to be, the Parliament has to give consent, so the details are still being worked out. But basically the indications at this stage are that our allocation under the European Regional Development Fund, the ERDF, is likely to be reduced on the previous round. So it's likely to be the previous round, there was just over 400 million, and in this round there's going to be, it looks like it'll be under 400 million, so the allocation will be reduced. The European Regional Development Fund, it aims to strengthen economic and social cohesion in the European Union by correcting imbalances between the regions of the EU. So in Ireland's case, we have 3 regions set out under the European, under the ERDF, and these are represented in Ireland by the 3 regional assemblies, and we'll see that breakout later in the 3 breakout sessions. But basically, in terms of ERDF, what this means is the 3 different regions get a co-financing rate depending on their considered level of development according to the European Commission's methodology. And in Ireland, the Northern Western region is considered a region in transition, so it attracts a higher rate of co-finance from the EU. So basically 60% of the programs are funded by the European Union, and the remainder is funded by the Irish state. And then the other 2 regions, the Eastern Midlands and the Southern region, are considered more developed regions, and they each receive 40% funding from the EU, and the remainder comes from the Irish state. So as I said at the start, the approach to the programs is principally determined by the regulations. And the regulations set out, in the case of the ERDF, a number of policy objectives. So what the policy objectives are areas where we can spend the money, essentially, and they are, the first one is a smarter Europe, and that's about innovation, digitization, economic transformation, and support to SMEs. The second policy objective is a greener and a carbon-free Europe. That's about adapting to climate change, energy transition, implementing the Paris Agreement. And then the 5th one, in relation to Ireland, is the priority objective, policy objective 5, which is about a Europe closer to its citizens. And that's about supporting locally led development strategies and sustainable urban development. So in the regulations, it also sets out something called thematic concentration. What that basically means is it sets out the proportion of funding that should be invested into each of those policy objective areas. And in Ireland's case, the funding will be concentrated on policy objective 1, which is a smarter Europe, and policy objective 2, which is a greener Europe. So the majority of the funding will go there, and there will be a remainder going to policy objective 5. So in the original proposal by the Commission, these thematic concentration hasn't been fully agreed yet at EU level, but basically in the original Commission proposals, 85% would go to PO1 and PO2. So the majority of the funding will go there. So that's the legislation. So I've taken you through, in a nutshell, very broadly, where the regulations set out where the funding should go under the different policy objectives. Then I mentioned also the investment guidance. So the commissions set out where they believed Ireland should invest, and they did this in their country report 2019. And in this country report, they focus specifically on the policy objective 1, which is a smarter Europe. And the Commission's view, Ireland's investment in research and innovation in companies is predominantly concentrated in large multinational firms. So for this reason, they recommended that public investment should be increased to boost SMEs' capacity for research and innovation. Then I'm paraphrasing a bit here because the text is long, but the other area they recommended was targeted investment for development of skills in small and medium enterprises. So this is particularly in managerial and digital skills. And they recommended policies aimed at reaping the benefits of digitization for companies and citizens, which is probably more pertinent now in the post-COVID world. So that's the investment guidance and the legislation in a nutshell. And I mentioned the needs analysis, but I won't go into that now because Hugh's going to talk about it in his next presentation. But that's the evidence base for the design of the programs. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Luke Devoy, who's going to talk you through the European Social Fund, and then
Hi everybody, and thanks Ben for that. I'm just going to get my presentation up now, and hi. So good morning everyone. My name is Luke Devoy, and I work in the ESF Managing Authority, specifically on programming for the next round. So today I'm going to give you a quick overview of, first of all, our current ESF program, and then I'm going to turn to look at the next round and at the regulations there and at the other factors which will shape our future program. So in terms of the ESF in general, I think you've heard already in broad terms what it's about. It's the EU's instrument for investing in people. It does this in particular by investing in helping people to find employment, by improving education, and also by investing in social inclusion. Ireland's current national programme for ESF is called the PEL, or the Programme for Employability, Inclusion and Learning. That runs from the 2014 to 2020. So under the PEL, we have a total allocation of just over 1.1 billion, and this is 544 million in ESF EU funding, which is then matched by an equal amount of national exchequer funding. This total then also includes a separate allocation of 68 million for the Youth Employment Initiative, which is, as the name suggests, focused on tackling youth unemployment. The PEL has 4 main priorities. I'm just going to take you through them here and some of the different programs that we would fund under these. So priority 1 is focused very much on promoting employment. So in particular, the range of vocational and training activities provided by SOLAS and the ETBs here, as well as programs like Springboard. Then priority 2 would look at social inclusion. So a couple of examples here would be, say, SICAP, the Social Inclusion and Community Activation Programme, which is run by the Department of Rural and Community Development and delivers social inclusion activities at a local level. And also we'd have the Garda Youth Diversion Programmes run by the Department of Justice and aiming to help young people away from crime. Priority 3 then is focused on education and skills. So, for example, funding here would go towards access to higher education for students with a disability or students from a disadvantaged background. And then finally, as mentioned earlier, we also have the Youth Employment Initiative. So under this would be a range of different schemes here which would help to address the needs of young people who are not in employment, education or training. And across this range of different activities in the current round from 2014 to 2018, we've had over 330,000 participants in ESF. So then just turning to the next round, I suppose the first point to note is that ESF becomes ESF Plus. And essentially, this is due to the merging of a number of different but related EU funds together under the ESF Plus umbrella. So one of these specifically to mention would be the Fund for European Aid to the Most Deprived, or FEED, which is a program managed by colleagues in the Department of Social Protection currently. And it provides food and other basics to the people who need it most. So that becomes fully integrated into ESF Plus in the next round. In general, though, the focus of ESF does remain the same. It's on employment, it's on education and social inclusion. But there are some shifts in emphasis in the proposals. So if you look at the latest Commission proposals, at the latest draft regulations, as Ben said, still being negotiated, they have been updated to respond to COVID-19. So you'll see in the latest versions, there's a particular focus on areas such as upskilling for green and digital transitions, on tackling youth unemployment, and on protecting the most vulnerable. Again, as Ben has mentioned, it's important to note that we don't have a final ESF allocation yet, and we also don't have a final allocation of funding on a national basis. So there was agreement at European Council level on the EU budget last week, and that would have included ESF. So we have an overall figure at an EU level for ESF, which is at 87.3 billion, down from 88.6 billion. Obviously, it's not simple to just translate that down onto a national basis. So we will have to wait and see what final allocation we get from the Commission. But our initial allocation on the first Commission proposal was for 514 million, and we would expect that to reduce in the new proposals. And then one final point to note is just on COVID. Ben has been through this, but it's just to note as well that ESF is also a co-finance program, so that co-financing rate will vary by region. Then in terms specifically of the regulations, again, Ben has pointed out that the regulations are really important in deciding what it is we can and can't invest in. And the key part of the regulations when you're talking about this is really the specific objectives. They're the key building block for the next programs, and they're essentially the different menu of spending options that we have and that we can choose from. So there are 11 for ESF in the regulation in Article 4, and I've tried to summarize them here in this slide. I'm not going to go through each of them in detail, but just to quickly run through them, you'll see again it's these three broad areas. So under employment, it's about access to employment, women's labour market participation. And then under education, quality of education as well as access to education, and lifelong learning, and in particular digital skills receives a focus there. And then finally, in terms of social inclusion, it's about actively working to promote equal opportunities, about integrating marginalised communities, integrating those at risk of poverty, and then also about access to services and addressing material deprivation and or through food or basic material assistance. So again, that's the feed type activities that were mentioned earlier. Another important area in the regulation to keep in mind today are the thematic concentration requirements. So these are basically areas that we have to spend a minimum amount of our allocation on. So you'll see a couple of them there on the slide. Social inclusion, including migrants, at 25%. So that's up from 20% in the last round. We also have to, of that, we have to spend a minimum 2% on addressing material deprivation. And then 10% minimum should go towards addressing youth unemployment, where a country has a rate of young people, a neat rate of young people not in employment, education or training above the EU average. Another couple of points to note are that member states should also try and support innovative actions according to the regulation. So this is basically that what we mean here is that any new or experimental ways of doing things, actions based on bottom-up type approaches are encouraged, and they're eligible for a higher rate of co-financing under the current draft regulations. So that's an incentive for us to try and program things in that area, something we're interested in. Also, a higher rate of co-finance is available for actions to address material deprivation as well. And then finally, the ESF reg notes that appropriate amounts of resources should be go towards challenges identified by the European semester. So what this is really referring to is, again, what Ben touched on earlier in terms of the European Commission investment guidance. So it's the fact that, as well as aligning our programs with the different regulations, we also need to take into account the Commission viewpoint and the priorities that they've identified for the next round. And this has been set out in the 2019 country report in Annex D. Particularly in terms of ESF, it touches on a couple of areas. One would be female labour market participation and childcare in particular. Another would be on improving access to employment for underrepresented groups. So, for example, people with disabilities. And then it also prioritises addressing poverty and social exclusion as well. Then just I suppose a further update in terms of the Commission's investment guidance would have come through the 2020 country specific recommendations. And these are just important to note, I suppose, in that they take into account COVID as well, which obviously the 2019 guidance couldn't have. So it includes guidance to take all necessary measures to address the pandemic and I suppose particularly relevant for ESF, support employment through skills and address the risk of digital divide. So again, these are just all things that we need to be mindful of in programming, and they should help to inform the discussion today as well. Finally then, just in terms of the work we've done so far in preparing for 2021-27, one key element has been, as mentioned, the needs analysis. Hugh's going to take you through this in a moment, so I'm not going to go into any detail here, but just to reiterate for us that it is a very important document in terms of programming. It essentially brings together a huge amount of different information from different policy areas and provides us with an evidence base which we can draw on in putting together our programs for the next round. Then in terms of COVID-19, obviously, this has completely changed the context in which this process is taking place, in terms of the levels of employment, in terms of how education and training activities are taking place, and also in terms of particular impacts on certain groups. So I think it's something that we'll need to be very mindful of. The needs analysis does take account of it, but it's obviously an evolving situation. So we would be very interested in your views on how ESF might help to address challenges in this area. In general, the views that you provide us with today will be very important for us in terms of shaping the future programs and drafting the drafting process and the negotiations with the Commission that will happen in the coming months. In terms of our overall timelines, we hope to have the programs agreed and approved by government and ready to submit to the Commission by early 2021. So there's a lot of work to do in the coming months. There will be another opportunity for everyone to comment on the draft texts of the partnership agreement and the programs before we finalize them. But obviously we would encourage people to, I suppose, engage in the process as early as possible so that we can take into account your views early in the drafting process. So we'd encourage you to do that both today and through written submissions or through answering the survey online, and that will remain open until the 4th of September. So you have a bit of time to do that. But that's it for me for now, so I look forward to talking with you later. Thanks.
Thank you, Luke and Ben. Thanks to both of you for those very helpful presentations. As referred to by both of you, we'll now turn to Hugh Hennessy from Indicon Economic Consultants to provide us with an oversight, I guess, on what is a very large piece of work that underpins a lot of our discussions later on as well, and that's the needs analysis report. So we will hear more and more about this as we go through today, and I'll hand you over now to Hugh to give us a brief presentation on this. I would just remind you as well, please, if you're not a presenter, to at least mute whatever about turning off your camera so that there isn't background noise or other interferences. So thanks for that. And I'll hand you over to Hugh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pádraig, and thank you very much to Luke and Ben for setting out the scene for the partnership agreement and the needs analysis. So I'm just going to set this up here. And please give me a shout if it doesn't come through clear, or if I'm my sound kind of goes a bit dodgy in the middle of the presentation, but it should work fine, and it was perfect so far. So as Luke and Ben discussed, my name is Hugh Hennessy, and I'm a divisional director at Indicon Economic Consultants, and we were commissioned to conduct an independent needs assessment that will inform the partnership agreement and the next programs. And this involved a lot of detailed analysis and engagement with various stakeholders. The purpose of this presentation really is to talk through the process, the purpose of the needs analysis, how we came to our findings, and obviously a discussion of these findings, which will help inform the discussion after the coffee break. So this is very much a key input to the partnership agreement, but it's a first input, and the rest of the process starts now. So just as an introduction, I'll give a quick insight into the purpose of the needs analysis, how we undertook it, the challenges we faced in terms of a very evolving situation, both at an EU level and a global level in terms of COVID-19. I'll give a quick run through of the baseline situation regarding the key thematic areas that we considered as part of the needs analysis. There's quite a lot of information in these themes, so this will be very much a short summary of our key findings. I'll give a short run through of the regional performance and development challenges for the 3 different regions. As Luke and Ben have described, this is the operating programs are done at regional levels with different co-funding rates, so it's important to look at the different regional performance challenges. Further description of the various regional economic spatial strategies will be described after the break, so I won't go into huge development about them, but they're key documents as well. And finally, I'll just give a run through of our key thematic, our key areas of need that we've established, and why we established them, and where we may set up for a discussion. So just to recap, we welcome the opportunity to present at this public consultation. We think it's a very valuable opportunity to get a wide variety of stakeholder engagement and insights on this, as I said, which will help the 2 departments and the assemblies form the next programming periods. So just I put up a link to the overall needs report there if people want to look at it as I'm speaking. There's a lot more detail in that than I'll be able to go into here, but areas that people might have an interest in, run through the report, and there might be a different section that you're particularly interested in. You can go through that. And just a quick recap on what the specific purpose of the needs analysis is, as I think Ben and Luke described. This is just to produce an updated evidence base to inform strategic choices that can be made by the Irish programming authorities for the next programme. It's a guide for the programming period. It's not a definitive statement on what the definitive needs are. It's our independent assessment of what we believe are the current needs based on an evidence base. And this just, and obviously the key needs that have to be established based on ESF and ERDF have to be cognizant of EU and national priorities, and obviously regional priorities as well. So I suppose just we've had as part of the Indicon team, we've had a number of different people working on the project, which is informed based on, as you will see, there's a very wide range of themes that we cover in the needs analysis. So it's that's why we've had a number of people. We undertook a detailed consultation process as part of the needs analysis, and we invited written submissions from a large number of key stakeholders, and we were very happy to receive 36 written submissions, which were very useful in establishing stakeholder insights in terms of what the key needs are across the priorities of ESF and ERDF. To undertake the needs analysis, we undertook a number of tasks. As I discussed, we conducted a stakeholder engagement process. We looked at the detail, we looked at the EU and national policy context, and as Luke and Ben discussed, the EU EU have come out with new documents recently, so it was an evolving situation to an extent. Similarly, on the national policy context, it was an interesting period, obviously, with no government in place for a couple of months. So that forms the national and EU policy context. We obviously, for each thematic area, we look at a detailed evidence base. So we look at public sources of information to establish where are the gaps, where are the key needs that require further investment. We also did a detailed assessment of the key regional needs. So each of the regions has different priorities and different needs. I won't go into that in too much detail in the presentation, but in the report there's a number of chapters that go into the differences between the northern and western region and the other two regions. Similarly, an interesting aspect of the funds is the complementarity with other funds. It's not just ESF Plus and ERDF, there's other funds in terms of just transition, Horizon Europe, EMMF. There's a number of other funds. I won't go into that in this presentation, but in the report we have a section on where there may be potential complementarities between ESF Plus, ERDF and other funds. As Luke mentioned, in the middle of the process, obviously COVID-19 struck, so that had a very significant impact on a number of the needs that may have been identified prior to that, especially in terms of the labour market. So just to go on. So just wanted to just a quick recap on some of the key documents that we would have looked at in terms of the national and European documents. So that we consider the recent Commission proposals, including the REACT EU and the suggestions for the next programming period. In terms of a national context, one of the key things to consider was the National Planning Framework and Project Ireland 2020, and how these developed into the three regional spatial and economic strategies, which are key documents in terms of the implementation of the operating programme and implementation of addressing regional needs. I won't go into the regional and spatial economic strategies in too much detail as they're covered in the next session, but these are key documents to establish how programmes are going to be implemented at a regional level. So as we discussed earlier, the EU sets out a country-specific report in each year, and these reports are very important in terms of establishing the investment priorities for the ERDF and ESF Plus. So this slide just gives a quick flavour of the 2020 report in terms of where progress has been made, and where some progress is made, which obviously suggests there's scope for further progress. So this would suggest that there's scope for further progress in facilitating upskilling for vulnerable groups and people in households with low work intensity. There's obviously a challenge in terms of the green economy and energy transition. So they're highlighted there. Digital infrastructure is also highlighted alongside the productivity of SMEs, and the link between SMEs and research and development, which is something we looked at in detail in our report. So just a quick run through of the key themes that we considered as part of the needs analysis. So we looked at research and innovation, which comes under policy objective 1, the Smarter Europe. So it's a key area of investment for the ERDF side. So we looked at how Ireland compares to the EU, and we found that Ireland typically has a lower level of R&D investment or D&I investment than other comparable European countries. We also noted that the HERD, which is the higher education R&D, is typically is lower than EU comparator countries, but the business R&D is actually quite high compared to European countries, which is likely linked to the presence of multinationals in the economy. But overall we found that there's scope for further investment in research and innovation. We also considered competitiveness and growth, which are obviously key areas for sustainable development of the economy. We looked at how competitiveness has changed since the financial crisis and how our SME sectors are performing. And again, we looked at that from a regional standpoint in terms of how different numbers of SMEs across regions. A key area of the next programme is likely to be the climate action and green economy area. as Ben highlighted, this kind of comes in with the Just Transition Fund, and there'll be a clear complementarity between the two. But just from our analysis, we identified that there's a significant challenge in terms of decarbonising the economy, but ERDF is only going to be one small component in the overall scale of this. So we looked at areas like retrofitting housing and sustainable transport, which I think were identified as areas that there's scope for improvement. In terms of employment in the labour market, this changed drastically in March with the onset of COVID. Prior to then, we would have looked maybe more at structural issues in terms of labour market access issues for groups, marginalised groups such as persons with disabilities, who have a lower employment rate than other EU European countries. Post-COVID, the labour market obviously is very different, and there's been specific segments of the labour market that are more likely to be affected by COVID, such as this youth employment and persons working in the hospitality and food sectors. And we look at that in our report. These will need to be examined. I think, as Luke said, we've addressed COVID in our report, but it's such an evolving situation that our report will be out of date in a couple of months, and these things will need to be feed into the next programme. But I would highlight there that there is importance to keep an eye on structural issues in the labour market, and it's a particular role for ESF Plus in terms of creating, improving access for certain groups. In terms of educational skills, areas we looked at were apprenticeships and how Ireland has performed in recent years. There has been some improvement, but we saw scope for further improvement. One of the key areas of the next programming period is the issue of digitalisation and digital skills. We looked at this from both an efficiency, economic gross value added perspective, but also a social inclusion perspective. Our analysis of comparable European data showed that Ireland had a relatively low level of basic digital skills, and there was significant scope for further improvement. This had possible social exclusion issues in terms of as services become more online. So we identify that as an area to consider. On the other side, in advanced digital skills, Ireland performs quite well, but there is still scope to improve compared to the very top ranking European countries. We also looked at childcare. We thought it was a key issue in terms of improving gender equality in the workforce. We noted a number of issues with childcare in Ireland. As everyone knows, it's very expensive, and compared to OECD countries, it's number 2, I think. So it's very expensive. But another issue that we looked at was the sector itself, and we found that there was very high levels of staff turnover, which is impacting on the quality and maybe the cost effectiveness of the system. So we looked at how that could be considered, and we presented the evidence based on that. We also looked at groups that are most at risk of poverty and social exclusion, and we put particular analysis on those groups and how they might be covered by ESF Plus, and in particular. So as I said, one thing to look at in all of this is the regional performance and development challenges. The 2020 country report highlighted that the regional disparities in Ireland are among the highest in the EU and increasing. This is largely driven by the differences in gross value added per capita, which shows a significant divergence. I have a slide on this shortly on showing that. As we've discussed earlier, there's 3 regions in Ireland. The northwest region is classified as a transition region, meaning it has a higher co-funding rate, which is important to consider. So just some statistics on the regional disparities. The orange line in that chart just shows the northwestern region and a slow decline in gross value added, which compares to a significant increase for the other 2 regions. Obviously, some of that is relating to the reclassification by multinationals, but the trend in the north and western region appears quite clear. Similarly, the northern and western region accounts for around 18% of employment, but only about 7% of GVA. So just in terms of the needs of the various regions, we've talked previously about the 3 overarching issues for ERDF and ESF Plus in terms of smarter, greener, and the social objectives. These are obviously applicable to each of the regions as well. Each of the regions will have different focuses that need to be considered. So just the last section is just to go through the key needs themselves, which hopefully will assist you in your discussions after the break in terms of what we should be addressing with the European funds. We've addressed 10 areas of need that we think should be supported by ESF Plus and ERDF funding. As I discussed, the regional dimension of each of these needs is important, and certain needs will have different regional focuses. Even within regions, there will be significant differences. Just due to COVID and other issues facing the Irish economy at the moment, there will be need for some flexibility in the design of the next programme, as the early years might be quite different to later in the programme. And obviously it's a 7-year programme, so a lot can change. So just a quick run through of the key needs that we've addressed in our report. I said there's further detail on, I think, page 23 of the executive summary, which will give you kind of a detailed summary of the rationale behind each of these key needs. So just in terms of, as I've discussed previously, there's a significant issue to address the scale of regional disparities, the northwestern region in terms of GVA. We've identified a number of areas that there may be potential for investment in terms of third level infrastructure and renewable energy technologies. We think they might assist in improving their regional disparity. There will also be a need for looking at the labour markets and in those regions in terms of addressing regional needs. We also, number 2, we looked at measures to support R&D expenditure. As I discussed previously, Ireland is below its target for R&D expenditure, so we believe there's scope for further increase in this area, and this may be facilitated through further support for the HE sector and the technological universities that are coming on stream. Number 3, kind of along similar lines, we think there's scope for an increase of collaboration between industry and the HE sector. So we believe there's scope for the ERDF fund to entice the HE sector to engage with industry in terms of co-funding projects or co-funding new product developments. And number 4 that we think is an important issue to look out for in the next programme is the issue of smart regions and innovation districts. These are just regions that are connected in better ways in terms of using digital technology to integrate planning and development and transport and energy efficiency and utility usage. We think there's scope to develop a smart town or a smart region within the next programming, or at least to look into this as a possibility for Ireland. As I said, it's been addressed in other European countries, so we believe there's scope to look at it within an Irish context. Number 5, there's obviously significant need for further progress on climate action. Much of the progress will be outside of ERDF, but we still think there's scope for ERDF investment in this area, particularly in the area of retrofitting, particularly in retrofitting. In terms of labour market and sectoral initiatives, we've looked at the impact of COVID. As I said, it's particularly impacting on the youth employment. So we think there's probably a likelihood to increase some labour market activation programs in the short term. In the longer term, it's the structural issues that need to be addressed in terms of group access to employment for marginalised groups. And that kind of feeds into recommendation 7 in terms of what I was trying to say there. Again, number 8 looks at skills enhancement, and I think particular focus on the next programme will be in terms of digital skills and improved access to improve our basic level of digital skills, which will probably be a complementarity between ESF Plus and ERDF. We think there's a significant scope there to improve digital skills for new programs to address that. Number 9, we think there's scope for improving the quality and affordability of childcare. where we think there's scope is in terms of the scope for ESF Plus, in terms of the training of staff in the sector, which may have positive impacts on staff turnover and meet an educational national policy objective within the sector. Finally, we think there's obviously support to keep supporting individuals at risk of poverty or social deprivation. As Luke said, 25% of the ESF Plus has to address this issue. The new guidelines also have to address the issue of child poverty, so it's important to look at that issue as well. So I think that's about it from me. As said, there's significantly more detail in the report than I was able to summarize in 15 minutes. So please feel free, but I hope that forms a useful starting point for a more deep discussion in the breakout sessions after the break, which obviously will be more regionally focused, and we'll try and bring those higher level ideas to a more specific area.
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you very much, Hugh, for that. And as Hugh said, that discussion that presentation will lead directly into our breakout groups after the coffee break. I'll go through a little bit of that with you all in a moment, but thanks again to Hugh for that insightful summary of the needs analysis. And the 10 points that Hugh finished on at the end will be broken into two neat groups of ERDF related investment and ESF related investment for us to consider in the breakout rooms, as Hugh said. And again, as Hugh said, the link on the ESIF website is there for you to download the full report, which is a very detailed, very comprehensive piece of work, and will frame a lot of the operational programs as we move forward. So again, thank you to Hugh for that. Excuse me now. Before we go to the break, which we will do now in a few moments, I'm delighted to announce that we're bang on time. It's going very well, despite the fact that we have a very packed agenda. But when we return, you will be assigned to one of the 3 breakout rooms. And in that room, there'll be a number of your colleagues and associates, but there will be a facilitator in each room as well. I'll be in the northern and western room, and Enda is going to look after the southern regional assembly room, and we have John Daly, who's going to look after the Eastern and Midland Regional Assembly room. So at that point, you'll be given further instructions, but essentially, we are going to spend 10 minutes having a presentation on the regional, spatial and economic strategy, a little bit of oversight in relation to the priorities within and contained in that region. These are fresh pieces of policy that relate directly to the national planning framework. It's critical in shaping our future, and it's timely that this event is also happening to see where the investment is going to come for these key pieces of policy. So there will be an exciting discussion on those aspects. To round it off, we will also have a quick Menti poll, which is a bit of fun, but it's also quite useful and insightful, given that we have over 100 people participating. So the results might mean something. And that will happen at 12:10, provided we stay on course with time. But ultimately, we will be brought back into the main group at 12:15, whether we like it or not. That's the way Zoom's going to work. So I think we'll get 60 seconds notice to say that we're going to be reassigned out of our breakout rooms and back into the main room. And I will then share my screen, and we'll present the results of the Menti poll. But we'll also then feedback on the content of the qualitative discussion that we're having in each one of those breakout rooms. So that's what we can look forward to after the coffee break. I guess we should just go directly to the coffee break now. Everyone's looking forward to it. Is there any comment?
Can I just address a few of the questions just in the text box, just very briefly? I'll cover some of them, and I don't know, Luke might want to talk briefly as well. Just Mike asked about addressing biodiversity and nature-based solutions in his question. And I just wanted to say that each of the policy objectives under the regulations is broken down, and it explains in more detail what that means. So under the greener objective, it does allow for investing in enhancing biodiversity, and it also talks about resilience and climate adaptation in terms of nature-based solutions. Terry asked about retrofitting, and just very briefly, it's currently funded in the current round. It could be funded in the next round because it's permitted under PO2. But separately to that, he just asked generally, is there plans to retrofit? And I know the Programme for Government has significant commitments in the regard of retrofitting in the future. Someone asked about community-led local development, and there is scope for funding programmes in that regard under Policy Objective 5. And then there was a question around the potential for ERDF and ESF to leverage other funds. We can talk about that in the breakout room, and I'd encourage anyone with ideas around that to write it in the survey when they're doing that later. That's it from me.
Thank you, Ben.
Sorry, Park, I'll just address a couple of the ones on the ESF side as well. I think Pia from Lergis had a comment about Erasmus and the connection between FET opportunities under Erasmus and ESF. So I think I've had some brief conversations with Pia about this previously, and there definitely is a lot of potential for synergies there, and potentially expanding Erasmus to new groups, and I suppose also in terms of partnerships and not just the mobility side of things. So that's something that we definitely are interested in, something we need to learn more about and build into programming, and something I think we can discuss in the breakouts as well. Then I think there was a comment on FET as well, and how relevant that is, and it is absolutely very relevant to ESF. And the new FET strategy will be something that we're looking at very closely. I think about 80% of our current funding goes towards FET type activities and activities through Solus. So it'll continue to be very relevant. And then I think Hugh might want to come in on this, but there was a question about the consultation with local authorities. I suppose just on our side, we note that there was consultation with the regional assemblies, with the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, and with the Department of Rural Community Development. Obviously, I think the needs analysis was taking place in a fairly short amount of time, so it was a fairly targeted consultation in that sense, but obviously there is still a consultation process ongoing now, so we would be interested in hearing views from all the different local authorities as part of that, and programming is definitely still in development in that sense. Thanks.
Thank you, Luke. I would just reiterate that point as well, that this is an ongoing consultation process, while the needs analysis is there to give us pointers. There's huge scope for submission, and that will remain open until the 4th of September. And then towards the end of September, maybe into early October, we hope to have all the analysis compiled and conducted, and at that stage there'll be some reporting back. But there's huge scope to feed into this process yet in terms of the consultation. Did you want to add anything, Hugh, in particular on that, or will we just
I'll just quickly, Pork, what Luke said about consultation, so we consulted with the assemblies in detail and the departments, and as I said, it's an ongoing process for the rest of the programme. Just a specific question on sustainable urban development. It mightn't have come across in my description of the 10 needs, but when in the more detailed report, I think the needs identified one in terms of the regional balance. There's a key discussion of that, about the need for sustainable urban development, and similarly on smart cities, that's in the same sphere, that it's important to have a sustainable compact growth model as well as what the assemblies use. So we've highlighted that in the report, and we think that the compact growth model is very important.
Indeed. Well, thank you. And I mean, there seems to be great overlap between the key objectives of all the policy. So the National Planning Framework, the regional, spatial and economic strategies, the language overlaps well with the European priorities, and also with the needs analysis. So I think it helps with the kind of discussion of these things, so that we're on the same page, so to speak, when we are having the discussions about these priorities. But without further ado, I think we probably have a shortened, I'm looking at the clock here, coffee break. But